And not so ironically, where I found myself was flying over 180 miles an hour sideways against the finish line with my wife and my son watching. Hey guys, how's it going? It's Rob Sutton, and today we're talking about half-mile racing and what was the wild west of modern-day car racing that is nowhere near the events that it used to be in the past. All right, so this whole idea of half-mile racing actually started off with really good intentions. People have their cars that they wanted to see how fast they could go. You didn't want to go out on the highway and get arrested for street racing, so your only other option was to attend one of these events and go out on these private airstrips where you get a half mile to floor it and just see how fast you could get. So these events really started off as a bunch of street cars just getting together and running down a half mile to see what their top speed was. These are not people that you were going to find going to a quarter-mile drag strip that's prepped with security checks and lines and everything else. These are people that wanted to take the car that they drive to school or work and really just see how fast it goes. And as it ended up, airstrips were the perfect place to get this done because one, it was the only place that you could find that actually had enough space that could run a half mile and a braking zone. And two, they were able to be rented out on weekends. Private airstrips don't see a lot of traffic, and they were able to take these spaces and actually shut them down for a period of time to let all the cars out there to have some fun. So ultimately, a half mile racing, what went wrong? Well, really, it was idiots like me showing up. So what I was doing back in that time was taking my street cars and modifying to the point where they would be good for road course racing or straight line racing. At the time, I'd just gotten rid of my road course Subaru and I bought a cts-v, a nice 4-door 6-speed manual with 545 crank horsepower, 470 to the wheel, somewhere around there initially in stock form. That was decently quick. But like anything else, I wanted to modify it to how I wanted it, and half mile racing fell into this sweet spot where I could modify the car and then really test what it was capable of out on the street and compete with some friends. So what ended up happening is this whole subcategory modifying cars got created that were being prepped for half mile events out of street cars that we were driving to work the next day. I mean, I literally had a Recaro baby seat in the back seat with a stuffed animal in it, taking a ride down these airstrips for half mile events. So what ended up happening through friendly competition with friends of mine and other people attending these events is we started chasing 1 mile an hour at a time. Through competition, we had to get faster and faster and faster. And incrementally, we started making these street cars into full-out race cars without really even knowing it. So what ended up happening to my nice 460 wheelish horsepower street car that I was driving to work the next day is it became a fully built motor out of Texas with a ported blower running on C16 race fuel, spraying methanol injection through the intake, and then having 2 nice big bottles of nitrous in the trunk with its own C16 fuel tank going straight to the direct port. I ended up making over 1,300 horsepower to the tire, chasing 1 mile an hour at half mile events. Now keep in mind, this is all done in a street car with no cage and a Recaro baby seat in the back. And then the second problem. The half mile events were really behind on the safety requirements when it came to these street cars coming to their events. There are now GTRs and Lamborghinis showing up with over 2,000 horsepower, and even your regular old Mustang with 1,000 wheel. So as these events started progressing, which happened really quickly, more and more cars were coming to these events with over 1,000 horsepower and no cages. There was essentially no safety regulations. We're showing up in the 1,000 horsepower, 2,000 horsepower plus cars with no cages, fire suppression, or anything else. It's a quick little safety check to basically make sure the wheels aren't going to fall off as you're heading down the runway, and then you're off to the races. So up until recently, there wasn't even a mile per hour mark that made it so that you have to have a cage in the car. And admittedly, this is my fault for not doing it, but I'm basically running down these runways with no cage and sometimes a fire suit, and really the only regulations were that you had to wear a helmet, closed-toed shoe, and pants. So I'm driving this bomb down a half-mile runway with nothing but my street clothes on and a helmet. And then the second part about these events is that you're actually renting out these airstrips. So there's no preventative maintenance you can do to prepare it for cars going down at this rate of speed. There's nothing that you can do to level it out. You're really at the mercy of any maintenance that the airport does on the airstrips for their regular pass-through of planes. It's just an uncontrollable and unregulated scenario. And that's why I call this the Wild West of modern day motor car racing. Because of the lack of regulations and the kind of just run what you run mentality, we really ended up with a lot of really powerful cars in one spot with not a lot of oversight on what we could do with them. And something was going to go bad, and eventually something really did. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of close calls that happened before then. There were a lot of cars spinning out at over 200 miles an hour. Luckily, in most of these cases, at these runways, you're not dealing with a really confined space, and there are no walls on either side of the runway. So most of the time, these cars would spin out into the grass, completely rip up the underside of the car, but the driver typically is okay, other than having to clean their pants after they're done with that incident. And then at my last event on a Saturday, I actually came through the traps at over 180 miles an hour, and the rear end got a little bit light, and I started sliding across the cement. I did get control of the car, but as I was pulling through the taxiway and finally got out of my car, my wife ran up, gave me a hug, and my son asked me if I was okay. I literally was chasing 1 mile an hour at a time and paying a lot of money to do it, to put myself in danger in front of my family. So that was my last time running a half-mile race. The next Sunday, I did show up ready to race. I put my car right at the front so I could try to get out there quick as possible. It ended up raining, and the last picture I have of my car at a half-mile event is sitting in the staging lanes in the rain. And then several weeks later, I got a call. A really good friend of mine had passed away at a brand new track that was a little bit narrower, and he dropped a tire of his GTR off the track at 220 miles an hour and flipped it through the runway. At that point in time, everything changed for half-mile racing, and it has never been the same since. Most of the companies that were involved in half-mile racing have now gotten out of it. There is one still left called Shift Sector, which runs a very organized event with very strict safety regulations and is very controlled about the locations they use throughout the year. But gone are the days of having multiple events in the spring, summer, and fall where you go watch and participate in half-mile events all over the country. It just isn't a thing anymore, and I really don't even know how they would get liability coverage to even put on these events at this point in time. And with those shift sector events, you are now seeing cars tip over the 250 and 260 mile an hour mark on a standing half mile with no prep, which is just mind blowing to even look at. Those cars have to be pushing close to 3,000 or over horsepower. So it's kind of one of those things that I'm really glad I did it, but I would never do it again. We just kind of got in this rhythm of just chasing a little bit more power to get that next mile an hour to beat a friend that I'm standing next to, and there isn't even any prize money. Yeah, I have a lot of trophies from the events, but it's spending a lot of money, having a lot of things break, and then reinvesting into it for a sport that really had no safety requirements and put us in a lot of danger. Now, granted, anytime you step into a car and race it, there is some level of danger. You take that on. But if you noticed, a lot of people get kicked off of quarter-mile events because they ran a certain ET and they didn't have a cage. It just wasn't the world that we were living in, and we really kind of ignored it for a long period of time. I mean, there were times at these events where I actually stepped back and wondered, how is this even legal? But it was a wild ride.